the whole point of silence your inner critic, it isn't necessarily a requirement.
Right.
It's a choice. It's just representing what is possible. It was really about, we're not saying to shut up, telling ourselves to shut up, right? We are seeking balance. We're seeking management. We're seeking how to be aware of something that we might not even realize is actually directing our actions.
Hi, and welcome to the Heart Leader Podcast, where our heart and our minds align. I'm your host, Amber, the lead minister here at Suivera, and I am joined by co-host and minister at Suivera, Austin, and we're continuing our journey into a new book that we're about to release, Silence Your Inner Critic. And if you tuned into our last episode, we spent some time talking about how that inner critic can really play a part in undermining our first impressions. But today we want to take some time and really start to talk a little bit about getting a common language around what is the inner critic. Because Austin and I were talking, and we're writing several books as we're releasing here, and one of them is about communication and how so often miscommunication just comes from the fact that I might have a definition in my mind about what something is, but he has a different term or a different meaning for what something is. And here I am going around thinking, oh, he thinks it's the same thing that I think it is. And so I'm speaking to him from that place of understanding. But then we have a miscommunication or a communication breakdown because, he doesn't have the same feeling or same thought in his mind frame around what that means. And so if we take some time leading into this to just create that common ground, that common language around what we mean by the inner critic, then we're all on the same page and we don't have miscommunication around it. And we would love to hear if our definition is different than your definition, what you might add to that. And then next, we're going to dive into some of the origins of that inner critic. Where did it even come from? Because often, if we understand where it originates, then that gives us an opportunity to understand it and just make different choices around it. Heal it, do just different things and make different choices as we go forward in life. So that's where we're going to spend our time today, just talking through some of those things. And don't forget, at the end, you can take some time and go over and pre-order the book or explore tons of other things that we have to offer here through Suivera, because we have a plethora of them. And you can do that at suivera.org. But stay with us through this, and you can always do it after. So, Austin, when we were talking about, okay, look, here we are. We dove into that first episode. And we were all eager about first impressions and creating first impressions. And then we were like, oh, we probably need to create that common language because, you and I run into this all the time. We came from different backgrounds. I grew up on one side of the country. You grew up on the other side. So even location creates different context and meaning.
Right.
And we don't often stop to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did, and we were more mindful of that and just took like that 2 seconds to say, all right, here's what this means for me, but what does that mean for you? So we start off on the same playing field, and I'm not playing football and you're playing baseball. Then we could probably avoid a whole lot of misunderstandings.
It's a really great point. And yes, when it comes to explaining, I think there's finding a balance, right? Because it's like, where do we start? Well, if you say water and I say water, I think we both know what that means. So, when kind of discussing that, like, I think there's a nuance here. But when you are talking about things, maybe when you're having the tough conversations, whether you're in a marriage or a relationship or in a business or it's coworkers, or maybe it's a close friend that you're talking through, and maybe you're sharing some things that are difficult to talk about. I think this is a great place to do that. And it could even be positioned in a way where it's just like, hey, I want to communicate something. And so I want to share what it means to me. And then that can help us be on the same page. And so that way it's not an expectation on the other. It's not like you're calling someone dumb for not, assuming that they wouldn't understand what you're saying, because that could be easily, switched around in that way.
Yeah.
So I think as long as you are just kind of kind and inauthentic and just like, hey, this is just important to me. So I really want to share what this means to me. So we're on the same page so we can have a really deep discussion about this, because this, whatever X is, this is affecting me or affecting us in some way. And I'd like to resolve it, or whatever the goal is.
Yeah. But I love that you bring up water and that we would all understand water, because I think there's an amazing part, if anybody watched the series Ted Lasso.
Wow, yeah.
Right? We think that something as simple as water is the same for everyone. But I think Ted Lasso pointed out that even what we presume is the easiest thing
Good point.
may not be the same for everyone. Because if you go to a restaurant, you might get asked the question, do you want sparkling or still?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
And there's a scene in Ted Lasso where they give him water and he calls it bubbly water or fizzy water or something like that. And he has not drank that. And so he gulps down this water and then he spits it out because it's that fizzy water or carbonated water. And he does not like it at all. But all they asked him is if he wanted water.
Yeah.
And then they gave him the fizzier water.
Mm-hmm.
And so it isn't that simple. You would think that it would be, but there are all these different choices. And some people like one brand of water if they're getting a bottled water over another brand of bottled water.
Right.
So in today's world, what seems like it could be so easy may not be as easy as we presume it is.
Yeah.
So even taking that 2 seconds could keep you from getting water spit in your face, right?
Yes. No, beautifully said, my love. Absolutely. It's a great example. So yeah, I mean, just in terms of just balancing and just making sure that it comes, if you're going to define something, make it feel like it's coming from you and not making it feel like the other person is dumb for not already potentially understanding what you're going to say.
Yeah.
So I think that's just that delivery of it first and foremost. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to today, I think us defining what inner critic means and, its origins, all that kind of stuff, I think is really important, because this is such a key topic. As we talk about, so much of what we do stems from within. And so it's imperative for us to start defining what things inside of us mean.
Yeah.
Because we may know it ourselves, but if we don't have a clear definition of it within us, then how can we even really connect with that with anyone else outside of us? And so I think the more that we are able to define what something means within us, it'll help us be able to communicate to others at a much better, deeper, and connected level.
Yeah. And I feel like some of us have gotten so numb to that inner critic that it almost runs in background.
Yeah.
And we don't even realize that it's there. And that's part of this first step, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is just recognizing that it's there. You brought it up earlier. It's like we've become so accustomed to it that we start to embody it.
Mm.
And this is about shifting that dynamic. Once you've defined something to a point where you can recognize that it's there, then you can do something about it. But if you haven't even taken the time to understand what it is, then it's hard to recognize it and do something about it.
Right. You want to share what it is?
Sure. So let's get to what it is, right? So from our standpoint, the inner critic is that voice in your head that is constantly pointing out every single error you have made, are making, or could make. So much so that you don't take time to recognize when you are doing something well.
Mm-hmm.
Like you get to a point where if you do something well, you're even talking yourself out of that. Like, oh, that was luck. That's not really how my life goes. And so you start to create this whole cycle of, I am this instead of this positive thing. And it makes it very hard to receive compliments as well. And so you start shutting out the moment somebody says, oh, you did this very well, or, oh, you look very nice. It's like, oh, no, thank you. No, I didn't. It was the circumstance, or it was this, or it was this. You start to shut everything else out instead of taking it in and allowing yourself to recognize that, yes, you have done good things. And so the inner critic is that running dialogue in your head that is constantly pulling you down and pulling you under and pointing out, even if it isn't a mistake, it's going to look like a mistake to you.
Right. It's a great point. I mean, and it oftentimes really stems from those judgments. I mean, I know as a kid, it's not natural to judge ourselves. It seems to be taught, especially when we start to hear no all the time. Well, okay. No wonder that we start to bring that negativity into our thought process. If we're constantly hearing no, or don't do that, or be quiet, or, all these things, we're just being told just how to even function.
Right.
And usually it's not a lot of like hey, you behaved very well. And, to some degree, it's like that level is expected. And so it's not really acknowledged. And then it's all about the no and negativity. That's what's being pointed out. So it's no wonder that we start to integrate this inner critic, because we're being criticized by everything and everyone around us. And so, and then,
it feels
that way. Yes. That's a good clarification. And so for us to be able to see that, kind of feel that integrated, especially as a child when we're just sponges, right? It's only natural to then begin to integrate that into, because it's like, hey, we want to be our own person, right? We want to, that's just a natural thing as well. But we don't realize the extent at which it's actually interrupting our ability to actually fully be ourselves.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, you bring up judgment. That's also a part of that inner critic. Mm-hmm. It's like judging every move you make. Not only is it criticizing, it's judging and evaluating constantly. Yeah. And so then that becomes your cycle. And if you're always being critical of yourself, it starts to create a pattern for everything outside of you. Mm-hmm. And so now you're in this cycle of that inner critic becomes that external critic. Mm. And it becomes very challenging because, as you said, you almost begin to embody it. Mm-hmm. And life becomes this burden and this challenge because everything feels so heavy. But there are tools and there are means to begin to shift this. And it doesn't mean this is the way your life must always be. Just because it's how it has always been, or it has felt this way at times, either scenario, it doesn't mean that it must continue in this flow. And that's the beauty of this, because we all have the power within us to choose something different. Mm. And that's what we desire to share. Like, here we go. We can choose something different. So let's choose something different. Right?
Absolutely. I love that. I mean, the whole point of silence your inner critic isn't necessarily a requirement.
Right.
It's a choice. It's just representing what is possible. And in essence, and we kind of talked about this in the last episode, right? For those who are just catching us now, it was really about, like, we're not saying to shut up. We're telling ourselves to shut up, right? We are seeking balance. We're seeking management. We're seeking how to be aware of something that we might not even realize is actually directing our actions. I mean, if we are that critical to ourselves, it's no wonder that like, if that's how we communicate to ourselves, that's how we are going to communicate to those around us. And when we can start to shift that and create a really strong, positive relationship and how we can connect with and talk with ourselves, it makes it so much easier to do that and experience that in how you connect with others. And so that's why I feel like us defining it today, talking about its origins, are going to be really key so we can bring the full awareness to it, right? I mean, that's one of my favorite things in the world is the metaphor that you bring up, and that is you can have all the knowledge of all the different painting styles, the different colors, the strokes, and all of that. But if you don't have the awareness of what to paint, that knowledge is not really helpful. And so that's what we want to do through this process, is expand that awareness, because we know we all have the knowledge on how to talk to ourselves, right? I mean, that's a big aspect in some way. And so this goal of this podcast and this book is to give that awareness so you can know what to paint, right? And so it's like, okay, now I know through choice, I can choose how to speak to myself and how to speak to others.
And one thing before we move on to like just understanding the origins of it and how we're going to navigate that, you had mentioned that there are some athletes and some individuals who are actually fueled by the inner critic and maybe caught off guard when we say silence the inner critic, because it's like, no, what do you mean? Like, this inner critic actually gives me strength and it gives me power. I don't desire to silence it. And that's where having that awareness of what we mean when we say silence the inner critic. And you brought up, we're not telling it to shut up. There's choice in that. So do you mind sharing? Because I thought that was a brilliant, when you were talking through that, like that's exactly it. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that, I think it would be helpful. It was for me.
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to athletes or just people in general, whether you're an athlete or in business or just in life, and your goal is to kind of optimize yourself, be efficient in your approach, and really, let's say your focus as a whole is just personal growth and self-development. And then you can apply that into athletics or, your hobbies or your work, business, et cetera, whatever you're into, right? So it's kind of like that full spectrum. But my point is that a lot of people might say, when you hear, as you're saying, when you hear silence, it's like, well, no, that's my fuel. That's when someone says like something bad about me or something negative about me, like, you hear a lot of people say, well, I talk to myself worse than what everyone else is. And that's actually what fuels me to be the best version of myself. So I'm not doing something to, show others what I can do. It's really, I'm using that as fuel to show myself what I can do. And that's a beautiful thing. The goal is not to stop that. I mean, if that inspires you, great. But the reason why someone is able to do that is because they have the awareness in the management of the words that are being said to them. They're able to receive them and move through them and not be controlled by them or brought down by their own words. They actually flip the script and they say, no. In many ways, they're saying, no, like, I'm silencing you in terms of that negativity. I'm turning it into something positive. I'm turning it into fuel for me to be the greatest version of the grandest vision of who I am. And I'm going to express that through what I do, no matter what it is. And so that's, in many ways, silencing your inner critic at its fullest opportunity, at its fullest optimization in that way. And so it's one thing to do it in like athletics, for example. But how do we then start to branch that into all aspects of our lives, into our relationships, into our coworkers, into being patient when, you make a mistake in anything in your life? That's where we are attempting to create this broad spectrum and this understanding at a more holistic level of the self. So that becomes just natural in how we approach life, starting with creating a positive mental mind frame and a intentional and purposeful conversation with ourselves within.
Exactly. As we said last week, it's not as though you're going to get all these tools and suddenly the inner critic is going to go on radio silence and go, oh, you learned everything. Oh, I have to be quiet now. It's just, that's not how any of this will work. And so anyone, at least never in my experience, personally or with anyone I've ever been in support of, right? It's a journey, and it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
And each person utilizes this in a different capacity. And so if your ability to silence your inner critic, actually that critic gives you fuel, as you said, that's a way to silence it, to say, you have no power over me any longer. You do not direct my life. Actually, you motivate me to show you that anything I'm saying to myself or anyone else is saying to myself is, I'm just going to prove you different. And so, nope, not listening anymore. You might not be silenced in that I don't hear you. You're silenced in that you're eating your own words, right? So there are different ways to silence that inner critic. And I feel like it's important for us to share. Like, again, it goes back to multiple meanings of the same thing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, I'm glad that we did kind of share that, because this isn't about ultimates or there's only one way, or, it's the whole point of what we talk about is about coexistence. Coexistence stems from an and, not an or. Right. So it's not even duality. Even duality is an illusion that's within a coexistence experience. So it's this whole idea of and is that it's inclusive of all of that. So we are providing a framework, and it's just a way to get started. Like, this is just for awareness purpose. This is for intention. And the goal of this is to say, okay, take what we are saying and expand on it and share with us. Let us know what works for you. Let us know, because that helps us, right? I love reading the comments and hearing what people are doing to either silence the inner critic or helping themselves become the greatest version of themselves. Because I want to learn. I want to see what others are doing. And if we can have that community, that becomes a collaborative effort for collective growth.
Exactly.
We all get better. We know we're stronger together. So why don't we all get better together?
Yeah. And we can even put a section in the book where the comments that come in that we feel are incredibly helpful, we can put a section that says from the community, from the Suivera community, and give credit and just like put the comments in the back so that we're all creating this together, right? Sharing our collective wisdom. So we'll have the parts that we're creating, but then have a section where we've all contributed and helped each other grow. So if you have things that you would like to share as you're listening to these podcasts and you're like, hey, I have a lot to share in this area, either write us an email at info@suivera.org and we can navigate from there, or post it below, share it immediately with the community, and we'll have our editors get out there and see, and we'll notify you and make certain that we can get it into the book. But let's share this together. So we can definitely do that.
Great idea.
But now with that said, let's talk about the origins, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like this, you pointed out, like we didn't come into this world like with this negative brain bias and this inner critic just running in our heads, right? We're just like, do you ever look at an infant? They're just like, oh, wow, this is a big world.
Yeah.
It's not just programmed. So then we learn it as we go along. So where are the origins? Because when we understand the origins, then we know where to start pulling the thread, right? And then we can unravel things and we can start to hold compassion for ourselves and we can heal. We can make choices that say, yes, this may have been how I grew up, but I can choose not to continue to generationally pass this forward, right? Or, yes, this is how society as a whole has been doing this. And we ran into this not that long ago. This might be how society as a whole has chosen to do this. But if it's a broken system, do I have to continue to do it? if I can observationally see that that system does not fit for me and my forward evolution, or can I say, just because that's how it's always been done, doesn't mean that I have to continue to do it. Doesn't mean I have to tell everyone else what to do at all. But if my voice and my mind is saying, I don't desire to conform to what doesn't feel right for me, should my inner critic force me to conform just to fit in? So these are things that we can start to navigate through and look at our origins. And today we just want to focus on the childhood experience's origin.
Yeah.
Because that one runs deep for many of us. Even with the most beautiful upbringings, right? We could have fantastic parents, amazing families, wonderful friends. But there are things that happen when we're children that get in there. And so we're not playing the blame game. We're playing the observation game. Let's observe. Let's understand. And let's not place blame. Let's just say, oh, that happened. Maybe that's where that came in.
That's so critical. I mean, we know that we feel here at Suivera that everything is energy. And when you have an intention behind something, that sets the tone. And so if you're going from this place of blame or shame or any of that kind of stuff, that's not going to get you to where you desire to be. So if your goal is to be in this positive and uplifting and confident space, then meeting it with blame or shame or anything like that is just, that's a non-starter. So I think us taking it from observation is that's great advice. And that basically pulls us out of the, in some ways, in the emotion of it and the expectation or anything around it. It's just, yeah, hey, this happened. And I can take from that. And then I can say, okay, this can help me get to where I desire to go. So thank you for that. I think that's a really important part, because when we do look back, it's hard not to feel emotion. It's hard not to relive something. And so us really going back to our childhood and understanding that what we experienced helped us make who we are today. And so there is purpose, there is intention behind all of it, whether the good, the bad, and everything in between. It's all experience. The best part is that right now we have the profound opportunity to choose who we desire to be. It doesn't have to be who we were. It doesn't have to be who we think we should be. It's just really choosing who we are. Because that's stemming from the most authentic version of ourselves. Because oftentimes if we want to say, okay, well, if I'm looking into the future, I want to think about who I want to be. Well, oftentimes that can trigger our inner critic.
Yeah.
Right? And then we're approaching it from this space of criticism and blame and shame and everything that got us there in the first place. Right? And so, so I wanted to at least preface that, because, okay, well, how do you look in the future? If you're like, oh, I want to be this, just be intentional again. If you desire to be who you already are, and I can say, I know in my heart that I am a kind and loving person, then it's not something I need to aspire to be. It's something I already am. And the more that I do that, the more I become that. And so we tend to be our habits and our actions. And so when we start to choose those habits and actions that are positive and uplifting and connected to our from a place of love and compassion, rare do we go wrong. Very rare.
Agreed. 100% agreed. So what are some childhood experiences that can get into our psyche? Like that inner critic it's wormed its way into our psyche, right? And that's why it's so challenging to reprogram, because it's not like it's just a surface level thing. It is embedded in that psyche. And so it takes getting into that psyche to reprogram it. So what is one of those things that happens to us as children that could be in our environment that can really get into the psyche and start that inner critic on a roll?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we touched on it originally, and so we can kind of explain this a little bit further, is criticism and judgment.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think that's one of the most prolific and, most experienced approach. I think humans have, for thousands of years, experienced and offered criticism and judgment. And so it's definitely an opportunity to start to choose to shift that. It's one thing, and maybe it's an understanding that we talk about, is the difference between criticizing and evaluating.
Yes.
Right. And so maybe it's just even when we talk about definitions and we want to learn that about ourselves. Okay, well, if I criticize, that's usually a negative approach. But if I evaluate, that's an observational approach, devoid of any emotion to it. It's just, much like we were talking about when we go back and look at our childhood, pulling some of that emotion out so we can just understand and observe. So words like observe or evaluate are less emotional in terms of the definition of that action versus criticizing, which has a negative connotation, a negative energy, a negative hold to it. Both can yield what we're looking for, but have a different intention behind it. So when we can observe individuals or evaluate individuals or observe and evaluate ourselves instead of criticize, that can help us make a different choice in terms of silencing our inner critic and creating a more positive mental mind frame and even clarity of our emotional experience from that.
And if you're someone who grew up in a household where maybe criticism and judgment was the norm, part of it is having compassion for those who participated in that, because it was a cycle, right? There, generations before, it was almost like a survival mechanism. And I'm not saying that makes it right or wrong. It simply was a state of being for many, not all, but for many. But again, it goes back to that choice. And you're going to hear us say that so many times in our podcasts. How then do you choose to break that pattern or that cycle? And as you said, shifting into evaluation, what does that even look like? Okay, so what are some tangibles about, all right, if I'm not criticizing, I'm evaluating. What does that look like? Well, criticizing might be, why are you so stupid? Can't you see it looks like this? And you do it like this. Where an evaluation would be, I see that you missed this step. So would it be beneficial if we went over the steps once again? So it's two completely different feelings for the individual, especially a child who's receiving that, right?
Mm-hmm.
One, the child takes on a ton of shame, right? I am so stupid, especially if it's a parent saying it to them. Where the other is like, oh, I simply made a mistake. Mistakes are part of the growth process. That's okay. And then my guide in this world is willing to guide me one more time until I learn all of the steps that are necessary. Two completely different flows versus criticism and judgment. I was just judged and criticized for making an error versus I was observed and evaluated and then shown one more time.
That's a beautiful example. And I think the reason why it's so important to pull these two together is because criticizing and judgment makes it about the person, and observation and evaluation makes it about the action.
Yes.
And so having that differentiation is so key because we all make mistakes. It's going to happen. We all do something that we just either didn't intend or anything like that. But that doesn't define who we are. That doesn't make us who we are. Like I've done tons of stupid stuff, looking back, hey, why not? It's how we learn. And I'm not criticizing myself, just observational. That just, I could have done that differently,
Yeah.
And it's just, and that's okay. And we can laugh about it and that makes it fun. So when you're observing it, I know that I'm not stupid, but that action was probably not my smartest, and it brings humor into it. It brings a whole different vibe to it when we can view it from that perspective, because it's not tearing the individual down because an action doesn't define an individual. Because again, that takes it back to what we've talked about in the beginning. That makes the outside define the inside. By observing and evaluating, we're switching it. We're saying, no, it's the inside that creates the outside. Okay. And so if it's outside of you, that means it can be adjusted from the inside. And so, hey, if you're going to make a mistake, that's fine. Then let's just go over that step again, and we'll do it until you get it right. And then you'll become, second nature to who you are and what you're doing. And so there's so many approaches that we can do. And that's why I love this understanding of it's not about the person, it's about the action. And then the person can be uplifted to shift the action. It's really hard to do it the other way. If it's all about the person, then the action doesn't tend to really shift. It tends to even maybe double down or get even worse because the person feels so bogged down and has so much weight from that energy.
Yes. And as you said, it starts within too. But I know sometimes it's almost easier to start practicing outside of self so that then you can bring it inside of self. Mm-hmm. There have been times I have even needed to do that because then I can observe it outside, then move it internally. And criticism and judgment may be one of those tools. So there's we all have to find a way that we can apply this and utilize it for ourselves. So if you are one who had criticism and judgment as a string or a thread you need to pull, and you find it easier to start practicing the observe and then do that outside of self, right? And then move it inside so that you can start saying, look, I'm not going to criticize myself. I'm going to really take the time to hear when I'm doing that and say, okay, well, I just did that. I recognize I just did that. But now I can choose something different and I can uplift myself the same way I did my partner, my spouse, my child, whomever it is. I have the practice now, so now I can reflect it back inward.
I like that a lot.
Right.
And when it comes to mistakes, I think that's also a good segue into another one, right? And that's unrealistic expectations.
Yes, 100%. It is incredibly easy to hold unrealistic expectations for ourselves, but generally that might stem from family members or schooling or social anywhere. As children, a lot of times we do engage in different areas where there are very unrealistic expectations placed on us throughout our childhood experience, right? Sports, you name it. We feel so much like the way that I gain respect, the way that I gain love is by meeting these expectations, because that's when I'm shown attention. That's when I'm told I am good enough. And therefore I must meet these expectations that are placed on me. And again, nothing good or bad. Often it's done to incentivize children to reach for goals. We're not condemning anyone who has utilized this to inspire others. It's about observing how it's being utilized, right? And understanding the impact it's had on you personally.
Right. I mean, it could be the same thing. And I mean, how many times do we see families where the same parenting style and there's maybe 2, 3, 4 different kids in all, same style, and then 4 very different approaches of the kids, how it was received. And so that has to do with personality and understanding of self and connection. So yeah, it's that's where this observation is such a key aspect. But I also feel like it's unintentionally from whether it's a parent or a coach or someone outside living vicariously through the child. And so, and I can see, I mean, naturally you want to do that when it's someone you care about and you want to experience, you want them to have like the best version of what it is for them, right? I mean, I can only imagine as a parent or a coach or a teacher or anyone is like, yeah, I see what's possible and I want this child to have that best experience. And so sometimes we just don't realize what that could do. And that's where this unrealistic expectation they meet and they kind of butt heads a little bit. And so since as kids, we're not taught how to manage our emotions, we're not taught how to create a positive mental mind frame, we're not taught all these really important things that are key to the development of who we are as a person, and we're not taught them during the developmental stage.
Yeah.
No wonder they go off the side, and no wonder they aren't managed. And so that's what we're saying in terms of bringing this forward is like, hey, let's start to help these kids at this age and help them understand what they can, how they can develop this approach that will suit them literally for the rest of their lives.
Exactly. And maybe instead of creating unrealistic expectations, we empower them with goal setting and understanding what goal setting is so that, hey, here's a goal. And here's how, if you've heard of SMART objectives, here's how you can be very specific and measurable and actionable, all the things that go with creating SMART objectives. And you know what? You may not reach exactly that goal because along that trajectory, you found something that's even grander than that goal. And then that teaches them and empowers them to understand how to navigate through life as it actually is. Maybe that fits for that flow. Maybe it doesn't. But these are things that when we begin to observe, we can make the appropriate choice in that specific space versus just saying, this is the way it's always been done. This is how my parents did it. And I feel like I turned out okay. I can't count the number of times I've heard that. But shouldn't we be striving for better than okay for our children? The moment we start to look at each individual as their individual self, the moment we begin to look at each experience in its own unique experience, then we can take all of these tools that we're utilizing that we've come to know and we can say, just like building a house, right? You pick the tool for the space. It's the same. We look at the beings, the people that we're engaging with, and we look at the experience. And we say, these are the tools for me and those I'm experiencing in the space that I'm experiencing that seem to be the most applicable versus using a hammer and making everything look like a nail.
Yeah, I love that.
Right.
Thank you for that.
And we also have in childhood a lot of comparison. That's another thread to really pull at, right?
Yeah, look at your brother, or be more like your sister, or, be more like your friend Bobby, or, just, yeah.
And may not even come from our parents. It may, again, come from a plethora of other spaces, a well-intended teacher, right? Who has the star pupil read their version of the paper and then tell everyone else, you should strive to be this, right? It isn't always, none of these are inherently a bad thing. It goes back to, how did it impact you?
Yeah.
And did it create some part of your internal negative self-talk and your inner critic? And if it did, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. So well said, because, hey, that may inspire you, but if you're unaware of at the same time, outside inspiration and internal criticism can be simultaneously experienced. And so if we only are thinking it's one thing and we're missing the other, like if we're thinking it's inspiring, but we're completely negating the fact of how much internal criticism we're giving ourselves in order to reach that inspiration, then how much are we holding ourselves back? And so I think to me, that's what this is really highlighting.
Agreed. Now, there are more. There are many more. But given our timing, I want to make certain that we're honoring of people. There's one more I would like to talk about.
Yeah.
And to me, this is one I found myself doing to my own son. And I had to catch myself and go, whoop. And that is overprotection, right? It was coming from the space of so much love. So much love. But in essence, I was hindering potential of growth, which then had the potential, had I not caught it, of stifling my son's growth, right? And creating fear of engaging in the world. I didn't grow up with that. It was something I created. And so it wasn't like I could look back in my own childhood and say, this is where this originated. And so I share this because we would very much like to say, oh, in childhood, this is a continuance pattern. For me, it was not a continuance pattern. I was the origin. And I was about to set it into motion for my own child. And in many ways, I may have still been overprotective. And the reason I was overprotective is that my son has autism and cerebral palsy, to be quite transparent. Very mild, amazing human being. Such a wonderful member of the human race. I can't say enough amazing things about him. But as a parent, when you know that this is a factor, there is something that could be set off in you. And so when I had to pull the thread and look at why am I doing this? And I had to be transparent with myself and look at my inner critic that's saying, why, you have to do this. If you don't, you're a bad mom. If you don't protect him and you don't do this or this, people are going to judge you for not taking care of your son. That's the thread I had to pull. But in truth, the best thing I could do for this amazing soul was give him the space to be who he is, exactly as he is. Be there when he asked me to be, and not overshadow him the way that I desired him to be. And it took me a long time to understand that. And so when you go on these soul explorations and you start pulling these threads, it's not easy. And you have to go really deep, and you have to be willing to be fully transparent with yourself. And so I know I've done it. And this overprotection one is really one of them for me. The other part of it is like over control. Like you feel like you need to control, or you've been controlled, and that creates a cyclical pattern. Fortunately, I didn't control, but I definitely overprotected. And so if I can encourage anybody listening to this or reading our book, be willing to do the deep dive, because it empowers you to do something different. And it will not only help you, it will help the people around you.
Thank you. That was a really powerful share of truth. It's not easy to put yourself out there in something that is so intimate and real. So thank you for that. That's amazing.
How we grow together.
Yeah.
I can't ask anybody else to be vulnerable and share if I'm unwilling to do it. So
yeah, and I'm always inspired by how you approach it from this place of, just because I did something and I approached it this way, it doesn't make me a bad person. I can still learn from it. There's still room for adjustment. I can still choose something different. It's almost acknowledging its purpose for growth as a positive instead of a shame or blame or any of these kind of things. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I think a lot of people can relate in many ways to that, because it is coming from such a place of love. And that's where a lot of parents, a lot of people in general, parent or not, are taking an action and applying it because it's coming from a place of love. And so us being able to kind of shift that and observe it and evaluate it, not as an action that makes us worse or less than and kills our self-worth, kills our self-confidence, and in many ways kind of kills us from who we actually are. It can actually be a space of uplifting. It can be a space of pulling the best out of ourselves and recognizing that it was a stepping stone to get us to where we can be. And so I just appreciate you being willing to share at that capacity. And as always, as I say in these podcasts, you inspire me every time. So thank you, my love. It's amazing.
Is there anything else you feel called to share in the area of childhood experiences? Because I know we'll be covering a lot under the origins of where this inner critic can come into play, because there are a lot of threads. There are a lot of threads that can really get it into our psyche.
Yeah. I mean, I think societal norms is going to be a big one, because that's not just related to childhood. I feel like that's a whole, that continues for our whole lives. So I feel like we'll be discussing that, in future podcasts here very shortly. So for all those listening, they can tune in. And the section in this book, when it is out, you'll be able to, if you're listening to this and the book is already out, then this will be really cool, because you'll be able to actually kind of take this and see the full expansion part relative to childhood. What we wanted to do is really take this time to kind of talk about it on a personal level and really just kind of share our experiences and then, our thoughts on this. And so each topic, we're not going to cover every single thing that's in the book. That's what the book's for.
Exactly.
And so we want to expand upon it.
We wouldn't have the time to do that. That's why it's in a book.
Exactly. So, but really the goal of this is for us to talk, share, and then hear everyone else's thoughts. So, if you are listening, you're willing to comment, you're willing to be vulnerable and share, this is a loving, safe space that we can kind of really focus on sharing what has worked, what hasn't, what supports us, what helps us grow. And if you have questions on, hey, what can I do, or what tools can I use to help me take this to the next level and help me silence my inner critic and start building a positive mental mind frame and create emotional clarity so I can be aligned, body, mind, emotion, and spirit. That's what this is for. So please feel free to ask, share, comment, all the fun stuff, so we can really grow in this collaborative community.
Well, would you like to wrap us up here? And I just want to take a moment to thank you for all your insights and wisdom as well before we wrap up.
Thank you, sweetheart. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Just another discussion on silencing your inner critic. We're going to be doing many, many more like this. And hopefully this helps and provides some insights and some thoughts. And please, again, comment, share, help us, because then we can take those and we can actually talk about it on the next episodes. It makes a huge, huge difference. And it helps us really connect to what you desire. What do you want to hear? What would be the most helpful thing for you? That's really why we're here, because we know we're going to share what works for us, but ultimately we don't have all the experiences. So that's where you all come in and we can help kind of talk about that. And that would be amazing. Amazing. So thank you. We appreciate you sending so much love. Feel free to click the link below to sign up for a pre-order. When you pre-order, you'll lock in your 20% off when the book is actually out. And on top of that, we're giving away our #1 self-love tool. It's called the Mirror Technique mini course. And it's incredible. It's just 1 week that can really change your entire life, your entire outcome in terms of how you actually start to think about yourself. The Mirror Technique is amazing. And my love, Amber, she did an amazing job with a video. It's like a guided video. Plus you'll get daily worksheets and actually supportive emails. So a whole thing, it's completely free. We just want to use this as kind of like that first step towards silencing your inner critic by actually looking at yourself, saying loving things to who you are, and get you started on that flow. And that's where this podcast and the book can help you take it to the next level. So please sign up. It's completely free. Lock in your 20%, get your free course, and keep joining us on this journey. Please join us. Visit suivera.org, and we look forward to seeing you in the Suivera community.